Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. I think it was in his unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon, that F. Scott Fitzgerald made his famous remark about there not being any second acts in American life. I'm not sure if he really meant it. Maybe he meant it to be so wrong that we would all still remember him. Maybe it's his second or third act. Certainly the idea of second acts has been a persistent theme in American cultural history. Bob Dylan, for example, we all know, of course, of his first act, which was celebrated in the last few years, particularly in the movie A Complete Unknown. But Dylan has had many acts. Of course, he's had many names, many styles, many relationships. And his second act, his main second act, I think, is brilliantly covered in a major new, I don't know if it's a cultural biography or analysis by my guest, Robert Polito, whose new book, After the Flood, Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace, is already being acclaimed as one of the major nonfiction works of 2026. Robert is joining us from New Paltz in New York, just 90 minutes north of the city. Robert, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Robert, is it a bit cheesy to bring up that old F. Scott Fitzgerald chestnut about there not being any second acts in American history?
Oh, I don't think it's cheesy at all. I mean, sometimes, like scholars of F. Scott Fitzgerald, don't take that line quite as metaphorically as we do. Meaning that you have a first act and a second act, and that they think that Gerald might have been referring of contemporary plays as he was, understood them in a way. But I think that, I was just interested in the second of Moral Dylan's career.
You're also a noted biographer. Your biography of Jim Thompson, the noir writer, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Do you feel when you're writing these books that you play on your subject's team? Do you consider yourself a Team Dylan kind of guy?
I don't think so. I mean, tell me a little bit more about what you might mean by that.
Well, that you're taking his position, that you're representing him. I mean, Dylan is a controversial figure. Some people think he's the greatest American cultural figure in American history. Others think he's a little bit of a charlatan. Some people think he stole all his stuff. Others think that, his great moment was in the early 60s. Others, like you, suggest that he's got better with time. Is this book, in a way, making an argument on behalf of Dylan? Dylan is notoriously obstinate about making his own argument, I think.
Well, I wouldn't purport to speak for Dylan at all. And in fact, the structure of the book is an abecedarium, 26 chapters, A to Z. And I think I first encountered that in the Book of Ephraim, the first volume of James Merrill's Ouija board trilogy, The Changing Light at Sandover. And part of what attracted me to that form for the book, in addition to the way that it allowed me to be chronological when I wanted to be chronological and to explore subjects when I wanted to explore subjects, was the arbitrariness of it. I mean, I wanted a form that would acknowledge the limits of what I know, what I can know about Dylan, and that I don't think there'll be a definitive or even a kind of comprehensive book about Dylan for a long, long time. And so that if anything, I was aiming for, you know, an engagement, an investigation, and an exploration without purporting in any way to be definitive. As you know, as I say in the book, I mean, you know, as far as I could tell, there's no rosebud sled in, you know, in Dylan's archive in Tulsa that explains everything.
Yeah, and of course, just to
So
remind
in a way, it's
everyone,
just the opposite, I think, of what you were suggesting. I think I was aiming for tentativeness and self-skepticism.
perhaps like Dylan himself. The Rosebud reference, of course, is to Citizen Kane. You're a movie guy, and I hadn't quite realized actually from the book how much of a movie guy Dylan is as well. That was something I learned from the book.
Well, there are all these stories that people who, you know, who have either ridden on the bus, on the tour bus with Dylan, or met him, and that, you know, he's always watching movies on the bus.
The subtitle of the book, which really resonated me, I'm not entirely sure what it means, is Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace. We've done shows in the past about memory palaces of one kind or another. Joshua Foer wrote a best-selling book, Moonwalking with Einstein, The Art and Science of Remembering Everything. It's about memory competitions. We actually did a show with another US memory champion a few weeks ago. Your book could have been called Moonwalking with Dylan, in the way in which he seems to remember everything intuitively, doesn't he? He has a remarkable, I wouldn't say a remarkable mind, whatever that means, but certainly a remarkable memory. Just everything stuck, didn't it? Or doesn't it?
Well, it seems to. I mean, people who, you know, who have gone on record who knew him in the 1960s, either by writing books or you know, sitting for interviews. One of the things that they often say about him is that he could recount more or less verbatim conversations that they had had years and even decades before. And so that I think that you know, the power of the, you know, the kind of metaphorical title for me, you know, of memory palace is that, you know, memory palaces were a kind of classical mnemonic device. You know, people would teach themselves to remember things by imagining a kind of spatialization of memory, and they would deposit things they wanted to remember, maybe in a specific room or a specific place. And you see that in writers as various as Cicero or Augustine, or, you know, the Jesuit Matteo Ricci. And it seemed to me that what I was looking for was an image for how much those late songs of Dylan know, and you know, the ways in which he might write, you know, a song that touches on the Civil War by embedding in it phrases from 19th century American poets on both sides of the conflict. You know, that kind of thing that he does over and over again. Or the way on Modern Times he embeds phrases from Ovid's exile poems, or on Tempest from Homer. And the Memory Palace gave me a way of visualizing, as it were, you know, the range of knowledges inside those poems: musical, literary, historical, cultural.
If Dylan's cultural life, at least, is made up of these two acts, the first one being Bound Up in the early 60s, and the movie A Complete Unknown, and then the second one, which you focus on, after, I think, you note in the book Time Out of Mind, which came out in 1997, to extend the theatrical or movie metaphor, there was an interlude between this first and second act, and it wasn't a very it couldn't have been a very pleasant one for Dylan himself, or maybe he just wasn't quite aware of the interlude. What happened between these two acts, Robin?
Well, I mean, my books, one of the starting points for my book was Dylan being awarded a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1991. And, Jack Nicholson introduces him and gives him the plaque. And Dylan looks like he's about to wander off. And then, he reapproaches the microphone. And what he said in his little speech there, like, I mean, I can only paraphrase it without it exactly in front of me right now, but it's something like, sometimes you can become so defiled in this world, your mother and father, and God will trust in your ability to, and that's because I think one of the, the obvious inferences of that speech was that he was looking upon, his work in the 1980s, spiritual failing. And I think a lot of people thought that Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award moment was the end of everything. It was Dylan getting his gold watch and, easing into retirement, and maybe every decade there'd be a lavish, stadium tour or something like that. But in fact, it was really starting all over again. Soon after that, he puts out World Gone Wrong and Good As I've Been to You, in which he's reconnecting with his, original folk sources. But I think he was also teaching himself how to sing again. He starts putting together his own bands. And that, and a phase of that culminates in, the album you just mentioned in 1997.
Time Out of Mind. And then, of course, on to Love and Theft. One of the things you don't, I mean, the book is jam-packed. It's not a very long book, but it's jam-packed, an incredibly dense book, but also very readable, Robert. One of the things you don't address directly, probably it's been addressed so many times before, but I'm intrigued with your take on it, maybe why you didn't really address it directly, is the whole Christian chapter. And also, there have been a couple of books recently on Dylan's, more than a couple. We've had a couple of authors on the show talking about Dylan's Jewish identity. I know you make a reference at the end in Key West. Maybe there's some sort of reference to his bar mitzvah. But do you think religion, for people trying to figure out this character, Bob Dylan, is religion important? Is the Christian chapter relevant? Or was it just part of that interlude between the first and second act? Did he have to go through it to get to the second act?
I don't know. I mean, like, maybe this is like a good example of kind of what I meant when I said I wanted a form that could reflect the limits of what I know and maybe even what's possible to know. I thought it was really interesting in 1991, as I just said, that he identified, his lapses in the 1980s as a spiritual failing rather than simply an aesthetic failing or a musical failing. And it seems to me that running through all of the music that I write about in the book are kind of spiritual concerns. And you just mentioned Key West, and that's probably my favorite song on Rough and Rowdy Ways. And I think that it's Dylan's, I think, kind of spiritual yearning, but in an interestingly kind of also self-skeptical way. I mean, the way that he talks about Key West being on the horizon line, it's literally halfway between earth and heaven, the way that the horizon line is. And so I see spiritual yearnings all through it without my purporting to know anything specifically about Dylan's specific religious affiliations, if any.
I remember, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm imagining this is the kind of book where if it's not in the book, you imagine it's in the book. that at one point in the 60s, even Dylan wondered where he got his lyrics from. They sometimes seem as if they're just delivered from somewhere else, from some deity. I wonder in this second act whether it was it was a bit tougher for him. Maybe the first act was unexpected. And I think you quote him when he said, what happens to a 20-year-old who gets everything they've ever dreamt of? What are they supposed to do with the rest of their life? Do you think this second act, I mean, there's always a remarkable, and maybe this reflects great genius or the appearance of great genius, there always seems to be an effortlessness about him. But I'm assuming he had to sweat. There's that famous Leonard Cohen remark when he met Dylan, and they were talking about how long it took them to write songs. And Cohen was talking about one of his songs. He said, yeah, it took me 2 or 3 years. And Dylan said, yeah, it took me about 10 minutes. Did this second act require a little bit more work, do you think?
I think one way of looking at, so years that I write about is that Dylan is something that you might call what he did more intuitively and spontaneously in the first, 6 years of his, of his career. The surprises for me when I went to the Tulsa archive really was how hard Dylan works. There were lots of drafts of a lot of those songs, multiple drafts, and songs will change radically from one draft to the next. And so for instance, on Time Out of Mind, what I found was 3 or 4 songs that Dylan had already completed, before he got there. And he ripped those songs up and took lines from them and moved them, move them all over the place to become the songs that we recognize from the record. I've always wondered about that famous moment where, in a hotel room, he reads the lyrics to Daniel Lanois. And Lanois might have heard every line that's on the record, but not necessarily in the songs or even in the places that they are on the album. And so that Dylan works very, very hard. He works, I think, harder than anyone would expect somebody with his success, his accomplishments to do. And some of it for me, I think, maybe goes back to folk process. When he was a young songwriter, his folk songs were often rooted in earlier folk songs of the 19th century or even earlier, child ballads and things like that. And I think at some point it occurred to him that he could take that template of folk process and introduce into it poems and movies and novels and speeches and histories. And I think with him, like kind of folk process bumps up against literary modernism, early 20th century literary modernism. Someone like Eliot or Joyce or Gertrude Stein.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up Daniel Lanois, who he wrote about in some detail in his autobiography Chronicles. He, very famous record producer. He produced Time Out of Mind, maybe the first album in this second act in 1997. But you note in the book that ultimately fell out a little bit with Lanois because Dylan always wanted to sing differently. He wanted to perpetually reinvent himself. Maybe it goes back to that old disagreement between Socrates and Plato about the value of the spoken versus the written word. Should we take Dylan's albums then seriously? I know, and we're going to come on to Murder Most Foul, which you have a very original take on, and the album which that comes from. Is the album not really the ideal format for Dylan, given that he always likes to record and reinvent and rewrite and re-sing everything he's ever written?
I think that's a good question because I think that the albums are really just the stage in his composition process. You know, it's preceded by these drafts that I've been talking about, but it's followed by his kind of continuous reinvention of those songs night to night as he plays them around the world. You know, even this week as we're talking, you know, he's on tour, and the the set lists don't change a lot from night to night, though they've been changing a little bit. But the arrangements and the tones and the angles on those songs change enormously from night to night. There's almost a jazz quality
Yeah, and
to him and to his current band, especially. You know.
yeah, and that's why the the reinvented albums or the reinvented recordings are sometimes more popular and more interesting than the originals. One of the arguments you make in the book, maybe it's the central argument, which I think is brilliant in its own way. I never really quite thought of it like the way you argue in the book, is that his Rough and Rowdy Ways, this 2020 album, which you love, I love, many Dylan people love, is his Nobel Prize winning speech. Of course, there was a great deal of controversy when Dylan won the Literature Nobel Prize. Some people think he didn't deserve it, he didn't show up, then he made a speech that wasn't exactly memorable. But you argue that Rough and Rowdy Ways is the speech. That's the legacy. That's what he was saying to the committee in Stockholm.
It seems to me that that album, almost every song on it, really every song on it, either addresses or engages his art forms in some way, or addresses the political world that it comes out of. So that that I'm writing about are very heavily collaged, and Dylan addresses that in My Own Version of You via Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the way a song like I've made up my mind to give myself to you is simultaneously Dylan talking to a lover, to God maybe, but I think he's also talking to his audience at the same time. Or I Contain Multitudes, and exploring that, or exploring the idea of transcendence in Key West, and the Kennedy assassination in the early 60s in Murder Most Foul. And so I think it was Dylan's real Nobel Prize speech in his own idiom, forms and idioms, that got him the Nobel Prize in the first place.
And it's a great speech then, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think that, that realization that you just referred to, that this was his real Nobel Prize speech, that's when I felt I could really start writing the book. For a long time, I was just kind of collecting notes and filling notebooks with sentences and paragraphs and phrases and things like that. And Rough and Rowdy Ways gave me a way into writing about the entire period, because in part it was Dylan's self-reflection about his work and his life.
Yeah, in a way, it is the memory palace, isn't it? I mean, the subtitle of the book is Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace. We could read your book, or you could go out and get Rough and Rowdy Ways.
Well, or there's a lot of memory palaces in this period. I mean, Theme Time Radio is in fact another memory palace. It's Dylan playing the songs that he admires and loves and have meant a lot to him, and that he's learned from on the radio for people, 100 shows.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about Key West. There's this great line from Key West, and when my son first heard the album, he thought it was the best. Of course, I thought the Kennedy one was the best, although maybe I'm not so sure anymore. But there's this remarkable line in the song, "That's my story, but not where it ends." it might also be that's my story, but not where it begins.
Yeah.
Storytelling is critical. I mean, he is, and that's perhaps why he deserves the Nobel Prize, and that's why this is an album in which he's telling his story, which is why.
Well, that's a good instance of the tentativeness and self-skepticism that I was talking about before. You know, if the last line had been, "That's my story," you know, there would have been a kind of definitiveness about that. But that's my story, and then he subverts the line or undercuts it in the very next one, but not where it ends.
And yet also there are some persistent themes in Dylan.
Oh yeah, sure.
You refer to Blonde on the Tracks, one of the tribute albums that you like. I mean, of course, it comes from Blood on the Tracks, his great 1975 album. Many people, including myself's favorite song from that is Tangled Up in Blue, in which he at one point says, but me, I'm still on the road heading for another joint. He hasn't changed in that sense, Robert, has he? He's still on the road. He's still heading for
still on the road, even as we speak. Yeah.
There must be something, sometimes when one thinks about him, do you feel that sort of Old Testament idea of he somehow sacrificed everything for us? He doesn't say it. He's the reverse of Bruce Springsteen. He doesn't have a very intimate relationship with his followers. He doesn't open up. But there is a sacrificial quality to what he's done, isn't there?
I think so. I mean, some of the ways that in interviews he's talked about the period that I write about, you know, was, you know, for instance, like in addition to the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award speech, you know, he'll talk in Chronicles about almost like this visitation that he experienced once on stage, and and the idea that he kind of took away from it was that, you know, he has this gift and he has to go out and play these songs for people, and I think that's behind, I think, a lot of what he does. You know, was this recognition that he was given something and he shouldn't squander it.
And in that sense, my interpretation, I mean, I've never met the guy. I'm not sure if you've met him. I'm guessing there must be a loneliness about him. I'm not sure it'd be a lot of fun being Bob Dylan, would it?
Well, I think it's certainly strange being Bob Dylan. I mean, I think one of the things that I pick up on Rough and Rowdy Ways, in fact, I mean, is the strangeness of being Bob Dylan. I mean, you know, like imagine if you could go back and tap him on the shoulder in Hibbing, Minnesota at high school graduation and tell him, you're going to win the Nobel Prize in literature, but you're going to fucking roll. You're going to become one of those people on the planet. And in 2026, at the age of 84, you're still going to be on the road performing for people. I mean, it just sounds preposterous, right?
Would it have seemed preposterous to him, though? You indicate that there may have been something about that boy in the school in Hibbing.
I lost you for a second there, Andrew.
Would it have been preposterous, though, to the boy in Hibbing? Was there something about him, do you think? Did he always have a sense of something? I mean, you know, Time Out of My, A Complete Unknown presents him as just another rock and roll guy, but I wonder whether there's something else about him.
Well, I think one of the things that I really like about A Complete Unknown is the way that it foregrounds the power and uniqueness of those songs. I mean, one of the downsides of most biopics is that they don't know what to do with the art that the person created, presumably the reason why you're watching the biopic in the first place. And I think what that movie does very effectively is focus, you know, how powerful those songs were, how unusual they were, and how they engaged people who heard them, whether they were hearing them in a concert situation or a small room. But I guess what I mean by the preposterousness is, like, you know, The idea that in 1957, 58, 59, that somebody could put together an entire lifetime in popular music and be taken seriously as a writer, an artist, to the point where you win the Nobel Prize in literature. I still think that might have struck most people as preposterous.
The Complete Unknown movie presents Dylan ultimately as splitting with the left. He chose art, they chose politics. But reading your book and being myself someone who enjoys Bob Dylan's music, I wonder whether there is a deeply political quality to his work, particularly when it comes to race. What's your...
Oh, I agree. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think he's someone who's obsessed with the Civil War. He's obsessed also with the War of 1812. He's obsessed with the legacy of the Civil War across the 19th and 20th centuries. I think a lot of his civil rights work in the 1960s comes out of that obsession. And I think even an album like Love and Theft, which is presumably titled after the Eric Lott book about minstrelsy singing. I mean, it's very much a book and an album that explores the interactions and complexities and contradictions of white and black musics across the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And I think Dylan is steeped in that. And I think part of the poignance of Love and Theft for me, it's implicitly Dylan's acknowledgement that as a white blues singer, he is following in a dubious minstrel, that it's inescapable. And I think his insistence on implicating himself in the issues that he's writing about is always a large part of his power.
Maybe that explains his sort of ambivalent reference to the great Bud Powell at the end of Murder Most Foul. What do you make, Robert, also of some other writers on Dylan's argument that, like Ron Rosenkrantz, I'm not sure if you've seen his new book, that the Holocaust and this issue of good and evil, what he calls theosophy, dominated his thinking and life. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I don't, I think that for the period that I'm writing about, the focus is more often than not on, American history and the Civil War and the legacies of slavery and Native American genocide. But I think that in the work that he did in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that's very much a central theme. Do you hear it in the music of the period that I was writing about as much as in the earlier yourself?
Well, having read the Rosenkrantz book and talking to him, I'm going to do an interview with him at some point in person in New York because he's not so good on the internet. It made me re-listen to some of the lyrics, and that's the problem, I think, with some of the Dylan stuff, is you can listen, and if you have an idea or a need, a wish, then you can always read something into the lyrics, can't you?
I don't know about that. I mean, explain what you mean by that.
Well, the Desolation Row, how does it begin?
I lost you again.
The lyrics from Desolation Row that Rosenkrantz really focuses on. I wonder whether also he's always sort of writing back to himself. You mentioned Tulsa and where all the Dylan data is in Murder Most Foul. He has a line: "Take me back to Tulsa, to the scene of the crime."
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that refers to the race riots.
Yeah, in 1921, yeah.
But might it also be a a reference to himself, this idea of the scene of the crime, of Dylan himself. You're a crime noir expert. Is there a noir quality to not just his mind, but to his narrative?
Well, I mean, I think he's somebody that, you know, tumbles through chains of association. I think one of I think the consistent ways in which his songs have been organized from the 1960s through, you know, 2020 is that, like, you know, and I write about this a little bit in the book, is that, like, Dylan isn't really a kind of singer-songwriter in the way that, say, Paul Simon or Joni Mitchell are great singer-songwriters. I mean, what I've come to feel is that the singer-songwriter model, in a way, is almost the James Joyce short story, the short stories of Dubliners, in which a moment or an episode kind of builds to an epiphany. And Dylan's songs rarely, I think, contain epiphanies in that sense. What they tend to do is kind of set up situations that even in songs on Blonde and Highway 61, he sets up these situations that are linked by a refrain in some ways. And so that he's often writing about and speaking about and singing about multiple circumstances at the same time. And I think that's very true of the period that I write
And
about.
of course, it's most memorably reflected, that idea, in I Contain Multitudes, another of the great songs from Rough and Rowdy Ways, when he says, "I'm just like Anne Frank, like Indiana Jones, and then British bad boys, the Rolling Stones." It's a wonderful line.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's sort of, you have those three instances, and there's almost like, oh, what's wrong with this picture, kind of, you know.
Well, but it makes sense in terms of
those three things have
Dylan.
never been in the same sentence before.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about Anne Frank, the Holocaust, Indiana Jones, Hollywood, and then of course the Rolling Stones, the quintessential rock and roll band. It all makes, it's not an absurd thing to say. And then, of course, there's that wonderful song also in Rough and Rowdy Ways, My Own Version of You, when he says, "I'll take the Scarface Pacino and the Godfather Brando, mix it up in a tank and get a robot commando." Is he the robot commando?
Well, I think he's the person who made the robot commando, isn't he?
I don't know. You're the expert.
I mean, well, it seems to me that like, I mean, the way that I sort of hear that song, in a way, it's Dylan talking about, you know, the musical and literary collages of the songs that he writes, and he found an image for that, and, you know, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yeah, and if I do it upright and put the head on straight, I'll be saved by the creature that I create. And of course, he's that creature, I guess, in a way. There's so much more to talk about, but let's end with a couple of wonderful stories that you tell in the book. It's not just dense literary analysis. You've got some great anecdotes in the book. You got a great anecdote when you went out for lunch at Chez Panisse in Berkeley over the bay from me with Milosz, the great Polish poet. After Dylan won, or as Dylan was about to win, I think, the Nobel Prize. I know.
Well, I think years before he won it. That lunch took place in 1999.
So just to come back to Dylan won the Nobel Prize, and it pissed off a lot of literary people, probably some of your friends and colleagues. You're a very distinguished poet.
Sure.
What did Milosz say, and what's your reading, so to speak, of
I mean,
Dylan's award of the Nobel Prize?
I had been hearing from people around Milosz when that semester that I was a visiting poet at Berkeley, that Milosz was saying was that Dylan was really the only American writer in serious contention for the Nobel Prize, and that the people like, say like Philip Roth or John Updike, who are almost expecting it in some ways, really weren't in serious contention. And what Milosz told me is that he thought Dylan would win the Nobel Prize if he lived long enough, that they weren't going to give it to him, in his 50s. But that if he lived long enough, there was a good chance that he would win it. And that what that also reflected was the Nobel Prize Academy's sort of suspicions about the value of mainstream American writing. That they were looking for something more political, more original, more inventive, than the novels of the people, and who were expecting to win it or thought they were in serious consideration. I've always been very impressed that one of the people who endorsed Dylan receiving the prize completely was Toni Morrison. She thought it was a great idea, and I think Toni Morrison is one of America's great experimental writers. Beloved is an incredible novel, but the others are too, and they're original, they're daring, and they're bold.
Finally, you tell a great story about how Dylan was picked up by the police one afternoon when he was visiting. Yeah. Where was it? Who was he visiting? And let's end with that story, because it somehow captures the surreal quality of what it's like to be Bob Dylan. Maybe it's the best example of what it's like to be Bob Dylan from the inside.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story. I mean, my understanding is that he was kind of wandering around New Jersey in the rain, sort of in search of, where Bruce Springsteen had grown up, just kind of looking that way. And there's very much a kind of hidden in plain sight quality to Dylan. Like, there are all these stories that you hear about him, going on a tourist tour of John Lennon's house, and nobody recognizes him.
And they recognize him.
Yeah, nobody recognizes him, or him routinely going to shows that where his son's band is performing, and nobody also recognizing him. And I think what's fascinating about the story is that he gets picked up by the police, and they start asking him questions, and they said, the way that I understand it, it went something like this, what's your name? And he goes, Bob Dylan. And they don't believe that he's Bob Dylan. So they say, what's your real name? And he tells them, Robert Zimmerman. And they ask him, well, where do you live? And he says, well, that's a good question. I have houses all over the place. And he starts listing the places where he has houses. And maybe this is a little bit like going back to what I was talking about before, about the preposterousness of his life and career in some ways to his high school self, is that it seemed that the more Dylan precisely told the truth, the more the police were skeptical and assumed he was just lying to them or conning them or crazy.
And the way you tell the story, Robert, he's sitting at the back of the police car chattering. There's a childlike quality. Of course, Dylan famously wrote about if you don't become a child or continually grow to become a child, you don't grow up. But there seems to be this remarkable, maybe that's his key, that he just retained this innocence. The whole story, the whole anecdote is one of Dylan's pure innocence with the world around him.
Well, his innocence, but also his curiosity too. It seems to me that it's a story about curiosity, about art. Springsteen is an artist he presumably admires in the way that Lennon was an artist that he presumably admires, and he's interested in figuring out or exploring where did they come from, what's the world that formed them. So I very much also see it as a story about his kind of insatiable curiosity, and it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of his touring is rooted in that as well.
Yeah, maybe we should entitle this interview Knowing Innocence, which would summarize all the contradictions in Dylan.
What was that? I couldn't hear you.
Maybe we should entitle this conversation Knowing Innocence, which somehow captures all the contradictions. Well, that's
maybe equal emphasis on each of those words. Yeah.
There we have it. Knowing Innocence of one of America's greatest cultural figures, Bob Dylan. A wonderful new book of essential. Anyone who likes Dylan, whether you like the old or the new Dylan or both Dylans, After the Flood, Inside Bob Dylan's Memory Palace by Robert Polito is a wonderful book, incredibly readable. Congratulations, Robert, on the book.
And, well, thank you, Andrew, for this conversation and those kind words. I really appreciate it.
And I apologize if the audio on this for our listeners and viewers and even you, Robert, there are one or two problems with the audio, but I think as with Dylan, all the good stuff eventually will come through. So thank you so much.
I hope so, but thank you. Really appreciate it.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.